Hinge, okay, versus the squat first, okay? So if we look at the hinge, or let's call it a hinge and a deadlift, a couple cues that are really easy to follow, and I did notice in some of the testing that was coming up, was that a lot of people were still having a lot of articulation through the knees in the hinge, or locking the knees out and not getting any articulation through the knees. So we really want to be careful when we're looking at testing the hinge, or even especially loading it in an RDL fashion or something along those lines, is that the differences between a hinge and a squat, okay, is that this is pretty simple. In a hinge and a deadlift, the hips go back, okay? In a squat, the hips go down, okay? So that's a really definitive landmark when we're looking at both it from a mobility and a movement standpoint. The other thing is that the hips themselves in a deadlift are going to be really dominant, okay? The knees are also going to be really dominant when we're looking at a deadlift, okay? Because we need some articulation of the knees in order to pick something up off of the ground and put it back down, okay? And we have to obviously determine, as we had talked about this, is where somebody should be pulling from when we're progressing them into traditional deadlifting, after they've already had the prerequisites of being able to hinge, being able to glute bridge, hip thrust. All of those are prerequisites before loading somebody structurally in a compressed standing position. But in the hinge, there should be very little movement through the knees, okay? And the reason for this being is we want that tibia to be vertical, okay? As vertical as possible, and I'm gonna be showing a bit of a tip to help with this as we start to move into our hands-on practical, hands-off practical, I guess I could call it. But we really want to make sure that we're watching this. So for some of you that I did ask to resubmit your videos, is really watch to make sure that you've got a little bit of a bend in there, especially if, for some of you that are more mobile or over mobile, you're gonna have a propensity of wanting to lock the knees, or that soft knee, it needs to be a little softer. Whereas for some of you that may be stiffer in the back line, or stiffer in regards to functional hamstring flexibility, you might want to bend a lot more. And so what you're going to find is you have to make sure you're pushing those hips back first before we start bending through the knees, okay? Now, if we start to move into the squat again, is that, I'll just actually roll that up because that's where we're going to start anyways. If we're moving into the squat, then we're going to be looking at a few different joints that we're going to be testing and also working through today. So the active straight leg raise. Now, that's on your hinge week, but it does still apply to your squat pattern. And the reason for that being is what we're doing here is we're looking at unilateral movement, reciprocal patterning of your right to left sides, okay? So whether it be a squat or a deadlift, which if we look at it bilaterally, still need to have bilateral symmetry. If we're going into single leg deadlifting or single leg squatting or lunging, we need to also make sure that we've got bilateral symmetry, or as very close to it as we can get. If there's a major asymmetry, okay, now most of you are pretty good. There's definitely some asymmetries, but I wouldn't call any of them a red flag, okay? And you guys can correct me if I'm wrong on that, because sometimes it can feel like major asymmetry versus observing it very differently in a hands-on environment. But what we want to make sure of is that if we have, let's say, this is a leg, just putting that out there. So if we have a leg that, let's say, is sitting at about, let's say, just under 70 degrees, okay? And we have another leg, that's a leg, okay, just saying, that is, let's say, 85 degrees. I don't know why I just did a percent, that's supposed to be a degree. Here we have an asymmetry. And if it's below 70, that's going to be a major asymmetry, because human movement, locomotion, requires a minimum of 70 degrees. That's just to walk around in the world, okay? Somebody plays a sport, whether it be professionally or competitively, even recreationally, is they need at least 70 degrees, and they probably want a little bit more. And if you're training, you probably want a little bit more as well, okay? So how this relates is that if you've got a major asymmetry, then you also want to be considering where and how you should be squatting, okay? So that is a big indicator. If you've got a major asymmetry in the active straight leg raise, and especially if it's showing up in a sit and reach and a toe touch, then you want to be careful with moving somebody into any form of a squatting pattern. Also, testing them in a deep squat is probably going to show up as non-optimal as well, so you want to be prepared for that. So, with that out of the way, our deep squat is, we're looking at a few different major joint complexes. Now, the obvious one is the hips, okay? So the hips, again, are going to go down. The knees need to articulate more than we would in a deadlift, okay? But these two are going to be highly dependent on that bad boy, otherwise known as the ankle complex, okay? Now, the other joint complex that we also need to consider is this guy, which is your spine and shoulders. So, if we're going into any type of overhead squatting, front squatting, back squatting, even a goblet, we need to have a neutral spinal position, a natural S-curve, and we probably should have bilateral shoulder mobility as well. That's this funky dude down here, which does not look at all like the test, but I tried. So we need to take all of these into consideration. So one of the things that I want you guys to do as you're going through filming your testing is I want you to take a look at your active straight leg raise again. Okay, so all your guys' videos are on the Facebook group, so you can go back and take a peeker. Oh, hold on. No, what happened there? 1 second. There we go. Da, da, da. No idea what happened there. It just pinned Courtney. It was a very nice photo, might I add. There we go. Okay, perfect. I think we're all good. Courtney, I used to have major asymmetry in my, oh, that's why. Okay, in your hips, big hip shift. But not as bad as used to be. Perfect. Yeah, so, and that's something to look out for as well. It doesn't mean you can't train, it just means we need to be very, very careful with how we're programming and how we're moving somebody through progressions. So, yes, so I also want you to think about your active straight leg raise. And I also want you to consider what your functional shoulder mobility test was as well. We're going to be looking at that next week as well, but I want you to keep that into consideration. So the ankle. So the ankle here is a big one because we need a certain amount of dorsiflexion in order for the tibia to do its job, for the hips to be able to do their job. Okay, all of the joints within this complex here need to be able to need to move and groove. Okay, they need to be able to slide and glide. So the tibia and fibula need to be able to have access to space, and the knees also need to have access to space so that the femur can do its job into the hip socket and the pelvis can do its job. So if we want someone's squat to improve, then we have to include looking at the ankle. And that means we have to have roughly around 40 degrees. Okay, now a lot of you have already screened the ankle. We are going to do a little bit of that today, and we're also going to break it out. Some of you are limited, which means your squat's probably going to be a bit limited, so we want to look at that as well. And others have lots of range of motion, okay? If someone has lots of range of motion in their ankle, you don't need to keep testing it, okay? Anything that shows up optimally, you don't need to retest it, okay? So, and with that being said, as the shoulder, just to go into a quick tutorial here, so these little, it almost looks like a jack-o'-lantern. These little bad boys here, those are the scapulas, okay, the shoulder blades, my little triangles. So we've got one arm going up, one arm going down. So one arm looking at the ability to have extension, one and having flexion. We've got internal, external rotation. We've got flexion, extension of the thoracic spine as well. There's a lot going on here. But we need to have a good amount of information from this screen so that we can really take a look at where somebody might be in an overhead position if we're choosing to perform a squat that way, okay? But it's also going to relate to a front squat position because we have to be able to get under the bar. We have to make sure that there's enough extension where when you get to the bottom of your squat, you're not going to round the back. We see a lot of people drop the elbows in a front squat. Same thing in a back squat. right? Getting into that extreme position to be able to fire the elbows under and then have that bar trajectory work well requires these things, okay? So if somebody is limited in a shoulder test and really wants to overhead squat, you got to really think about the risk versus reward factor on that. Okay, and some of you are coming up with some shoulder stuff as well, so we'll look at that in 4 and 5. Okay,